Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our fourth Asia-Pacific Water Forum webinar. My name is Yumiko Asayama, Manager of Japan Water Forum, and also taking care of the Asia-Pacific Water Forum. Today's webinar will be about the integrated water resource management from source to sea, linking the Water SDG 6 and also Ocean SDG 14. The speaker is Dr. Torkil Jønch Clausen. He is the International Water Advisor and also Chair of the Scientific Program Committee of the World Water Week of Stockholm, as well as Chair of the Action Platform of Source to Sea Management. Today, we will have about 25 minutes presentation from Dr. Torkil. Then we will shift to the Q&A, which is facilitated by Mr. Ravi Narayanan, Chair of the APWF Governing Council. We will cordially appreciate your question after the presentation from Dr. Torkil. It is very, very helpful if you can kindly add your question to the Q&A box. Then we will follow up your question. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Ravi Narayanan, Governing Council Chair of the APWF, to deliver opening remarks. Ravi, thank you for your speech.
Thank you, Yumiko. Well, at the fourth webinar, the APWF webinar, is on an extremely important topic, integrated water resource management from source to sea. It is ironic that when we talk about water resources, the largest area of the Earth's surface is covered by water, but oceans, we completely ignore it, you know. So we talk about freshwater and saltwater. Saltwater skips out of our minds so conveniently. And yet it is so crucial to the health and well-being of all beings on this planet and for our environment. To address this question, we have Dr. Torkil. He's got, whom many of you know, he's got a CV as long as your arm and your leg. So I won't go through all of it, except to say that in addition to what Yumiko has already said about his current positions, he has recently served as the chair of the GWP on water scarcity in agriculture, governor of the World Water Council, and he is the winner of the King Hassan II Great Water Prize in 2006. He was awarded it by the government of Morocco. What is the important thing about Torkil is he speaks his mind. He talks straight from the heart. He's a passionate advocate of IWRM, and as we will hear, IWRM on a scale much bigger than what we have thought it would be. And he is direct and to the point. So without further ado, Torkil, over to you.
Thank you, Ravi. Okay, thank you very much, Ravi and Yumiko and Asia Pacific Water Forum for inviting me for this. I shall try to do my best to follow instructions with speaking 25 minutes and then hopefully have a good discussion. Can you see my screen, Ravi?
Yes. Yes.
It works? Okay. So let me start addressing this talk, which is about integrated water resources management, which we call IWRM, but from source to sea, stressing that wider context, as Ravi just said, and also in this day and age, stressing how important it is to link the Sustainable Development Goals on freshwater and on oceans. So let me now see. Okay, I did it that way. Let me start addressing sort of the backdrop, the sort of the major background for why we're here. I mean, still today, in 2020, we have a said billion people who are poor, a billion people who go hungry to bed, billion people without access to safe water, billion people without access to electricity, and 2-3 times that much without sanitation. A lot of these people are the same, of course, and a lot of them are victims of our mismanagement of water. And the question is, will these people be better off by mid-century when food demand, energy demand, water demand is increasing by 50%? And in a world with climate change that makes these challenges even more acute. Now, 60% of the world's population is in your region, is in Asia Pacific. So these numbers are close to your own. If we look at the world map, and I'm not going to detail, but the red is sort of physical and the yellow economic water scarcity, you see that Asia Pacific is really one of the regions that are heavily challenged on this. So how do we address this? And I think the key message here for me is that if you look at the SDGs, water is flowing as a connector through the SDGs. You can illustrate it this way. I mean, you all know the 17 SDGs. I'm not going to go through that. And you also know that our water SDG 6, with the 6 targets of safe water, sanitation, water quality, water efficiency, IWRM, and ecosystems, is in fact a connector across it. I mean, UN estimates that more than half of the 169 targets of the SDG agenda are strongly water dependent. So SDGs for water is a lot more than SDG 6. It's practically all of them. And when we then look at water and look at SDG 6, then the target SDG 6.5 on integrated water resources management is really key. Now, we have a definition. It was developed 20 years ago by Global Water Partnership, where integrated water resources management is a process that promotes the coordinated development and management on water and related resources in order to maximize well, my slide slipped, but you will have the sentence is long and complicated, so I'll give you the more accessible version of it. IWRM is about addressing increased competition for water. There's only so much, and we are so many more to share. So competition for water happens within countries, between users. It happens between countries in transboundary basins. And the only way we can address that is by effective water governance. And water governance is really IWRM. Now, IWRM, or Integrated Water Resources Management, is not rocket science. It's very simple. It's a question on how do we maximize water's role in achieving economic, social, and environmental development by getting the 3 pillars right. The enabling environment, having the right policies, legislation, regulations, the institutional framework to make this enabling environment work at the central level, the local level, the river basin level, and between public, private, and civic actors, and then a set of management instruments for these institutions. It's that simple. Another very simple illustration of IWRM is that what we need is to manage competing uses across sectors. We need water for people, for domestic use. We need water for food, a lot of it. We need water for nature. We need water for energy, for industry. How do we manage these competing uses? This is what IWRM is all about. Simple to say, hard to do. Now, IWRM has been with us since the Rio conference in '92, and there's been a lot of discussion about it, but it did become a target of the Sustainable Development Goals. So target 6.5 is implementing IWRM at all levels, including through transboundary cooperation as possible. And to take ourselves to task and be accountable, there are 2 indicators that are monitored. One is 651, IWRM generally at all levels, and one is 652, which is monitoring how we are doing on transboundary management. You can also illustrate it in another way, that if you look at how we achieve goal 6, for example, water supply, sanitation, quality, ecosystem, so forth, IWRM is of course the key to achieve all these things. But then also IWRM has to link to integrated urban water management. IWRM was by IPCC seen as the mechanism for climate change adaptation. IWRM is behind the so-called water, food, energy nexus. I will come back to that. And then IWRM is very much something that includes what we call integrated coastal management. I'll come back to that. So you can see IWRM is a broad framework for water management across sectors, across stakeholder groups. Now let's make it sort of living in your region. This is Mekong. You all know the Mekong, and the red part is the Mekong Delta. If you look at what IWRM is like in the Mekong, for example, then the I in IWRM, the integration is both the horizontal integration, as I just illustrated, across sectors, across stakeholders, but also the vertical integration. So like in the Mekong, you have an IWRM-based Mekong strategy. You have national IWRM strategies for the 6 countries. You have IWRM strategies for the river basins, for the sub-basin, even in some cases down to the watershed level. So IWRM in the Mekong is integration across levels and across sectors and stakeholders. When you look at the Mekong, you also know that upstream in the Mekong, dams are being built. That gives a rise to a lot of discussion to produce energy, while in the lower part, you have the Mekong Delta producing a lot of food. And somehow these things will be competing, right? And if you don't build the right dams, the right places, you can destroy your food production downstream. If you build them the right way, the right places, you can help. So that is what we call the water, food, energy nexus. I mean, the 2 biggest water users are really the food and the energy sectors. So this nexus makes a lot of sense. And again, it's all about linking SDGs, is it not? I mean, we have SDG 2 on food, we have SDG 7 on energy, and then SDG 6 on water that kind of links these things. Asia Pacific, well, I have lived there. I've lived in Bangladesh with my family. I've lived in Laos with my family. I love that region. And I also love the spirit and the progress you see in this region. And for me, working with IWRM, I have always been gratified because you see the countries of Asia Pacific are really taking IWRM to heart and did that also before it became a SDG target. Now, the baseline by the UN a couple of years ago was that 80% of the countries in the region have laid the foundations for IWRM, which is good. Of course, if you look at the spread, there are some countries that are doing very well and some countries that are not doing so well. That's everywhere like that, also in my own region, in Europe. But the 80% is impressive. Well, there are, of course, international actors like UNEP, Global Water Partnership, others that help countries to achieve this target on IWRM. And so there are global support to make this happen and to monitor that it actually happens. Those are the ones that produce these numbers. But so much for IWRM. This was my freshwater part, IWRM, but the freshwater is much more than freshwater. And this is, as Ravi alluded to, the key. Our oceans are dying. And why? We have dead zones, we have plastic islands, we have corals disappearing, and most of these things are due to our mismanagement of the water resources that feed into the oceans. I mean, sadly, still today, some 80% of sewage goes into the system untreated. Plastic production has increased 20-fold over the last 50 years. And on I could go. So as a result, virtually no marine area is unaffected by human activity. And dead zones in coastal areas, for example, have spread exponentially. These are just examples. If you look at the pollution of the sea from land-based sources, here's a map that shows some red areas. I don't want to point a finger at Asia, because if you point a finger at some, you point three at yourself, don't you? So you have some challenges in Asia on the pollution from land-based sources, but we certainly also have challenges in Europe. Look at Europe, it's red. And look at my own backyard. I'm from Denmark, in the lower left corner of this map of the Baltic Sea, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Poland, and so forth. We are a rich country and we should do better. But look at the colors. The Baltic Sea is red. None of the open bases of the Baltic Sea have acceptable ecosystem health status. And that affects the biodiversity, that affects hazardous substances going into the Baltic Sea, and Baltic Sea as a global hotspot for eutrophication due to nutrients. So, you know, this is a global problem, and no region is doing well enough to address this. So we need an approach to address, and that's what we call source to sea. Some people call it H2O, hilltop to ocean. That's a smart one. Or coral to reef. There are many ways, but the source to sea approach is really about addressing what are the main flows that go into the sea. The water, the biota, the sediments flow into the sea, carrying with them pollutants and materials, such as plastic, for example, and affecting our ecosystem. We have to know and address these main flows. Let me run through them quickly. For example, fish. When we exploit our rivers, we put pressure on fisheries, and as a result, we get lower fish survival, for example, salmon. I lived 3 years in the Mekong Basin, and you all know the discussions in the Mekong about how development of dams in the Mekong affect the fisheries and the spawning grounds and whatever. If you look at the pollution and material flows, 89% of all marine debris is land-based. Millions of tons of plastic enter the oceans every year. But probably the most important one are the diffuse sources of pollution. This is a major challenge in not just most countries, all countries, notably agrochemicals, nutrients, pesticides, herbicides, and so on. And look at the sediments. We all know that. If you have too much sediment, we get flood risks, smothering of coastal habitats, landslides. If we have too little, we get delta starvation, erosion. It was singled out as the key problem in the Mekong River as a result of dam building. And here you can see the Yellow River Delta, how it developed over 20 years. It's clear that the sediments flowing into the sea is a key issue to address. So if you want to address this, we have, of course, first have to understand the cycle, from source to sea, from mountain, land, the freshwater system, to the estuaries, the deltas, the coastline, the nearshore, the adjoining sea shelf, into the open sea. And it's a cycle. With climate change, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion goes the other way, right? So it's a cycle. And what we need to do is pretty obvious. We need to take a holistic view. And that's why we call it from source to sea. You can call it ridge to reef or hilltop to ocean, whatever you call the baby. But this is important. Have the holistic view, engage upstream and downstream stakeholders, and then with these stakeholders, innovate new solutions and implement them. It's that simple. Again, like IWRM, simple to say, hard to do. But one of the big constraints we have is that we are in two worlds. When you go to World Water Forum and World Water Week in Stockholm, how many marine people do you see? You have a sea of freshwater people, very few marine. And the other way around, if you go to ocean conferences, how many freshwater people go? We have two distinct communities. We have hydrologists and water engineers that talk about IWRM. And then we, on the one hand, and then we have marine scientists and who talk about integrated coastal management, ICM. But they don't talk to each other. That's the problem. And that is the challenge. Challenge is a better word than problem. In fact, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, produced a report last year, a special report on the ocean and cryosphere, arguing that the misery for the ocean is the fragmented governance. I mean, you have marine spatial planning on the one hand, land use planning on the other. You have water management policy on the one hand, marine on the other. And these are silos. And as long as that happens, we have a problem. And this is where we come to the linking of SDGs. In fact, some cynics would say that the 17 SDGs are 17 silos, each one of them formulated, driven, implemented by each their community. Well, that's the rough version, but there's a lot of truth to it. Now, we talked already about SDG 6 on water. SDG 14 is the Ocean SDG. And let me show the two targets. I mean, you all know the water targets by heart, but the two first targets of the Ocean SDG is to reduce pollution from land-based activities. Land-based activities in the Ocean SDG. And sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems. So it's obvious, it's clear that you cannot achieve SDG 14 unless you achieve SDG 6, right? And yet, these two SDGs, when you look at them, how they were formulated, how they are monitored, are sadly two silos still. It's obvious. I mean, we like water people, we like to think in basins. I always think in basins, and we all do. I know Asia is very strong. When I lived there, Asia is very good on river basin management, and we all think in basins. But look at the basin. I mean, in the upper part of the basin, you have the IWRM. Many of the big cities, also cities of Asia, are on the coast, right? And there you have another community, the urban community, talking integrated urban water management. And then you have a coastal community talking integrated coastal management. But are these integrated approaches integrated? That's the question. They should at least be coordinated. I'm not saying integrated. Coordinated may be a better word. People have also tried another thing that's very useful, to map the targets of the two SDGs. On top, you have SDG 14 on oceans. It's got 7 targets. And our own water target has 6, water SDG 6 has 6 targets plus A and B. They all have A and B. And there you can see that some of them, the dark colors show that there's a very strong linkage. And it's clear that the linkage between SDG 14.1 on land-based activity and 14.2 on sustainable ecosystem is linked strongly to 6.3, which is water quality and wastewater, 6.5 IWRM, that I showed with the red, and 6.6 freshwater ecosystems. So the linkages are very strong. We also, when you look at the IWRM target and 6.5.2, you look at the transboundary basins. I mean, the major transboundary basins, of course, of the world, including in Asia, the Mekong, the Yellow, and others, Irrawaddy. And these basins, how important they are for the receiving waters. I mean, the Bay of Bengal is totally dependent on how we manage Ganges Brahmaputra, obviously. So, in a sense, Asia Pacific is a hotspot for many things. That's a good thing about Asia Pacific in one way, but it's also a hotspot for this issue. And I was there in Myanmar a couple of years ago for the Asia Pacific Water Summits. I've been to all of them. It's always a highlight for me to come to there. But here are some of the things that transpired a couple of years ago from Myanmar at the 3rd Asia Pacific Water Summit. The total value of Asia Pacific fisheries was reported at $2 billion. Now, don't kill me for these figures. I'm just quoting what people told me at the summit. These are things that were shown at the summit. The value of Asian Asia-Pacific tourism 3% of GDP. And these things are threatened. You have marine hotspots, China Sea, Coral Triangle, Bay of Bengal. You have all this plastic, millions of tons of plastic. In fact, globally, the 5 most important countries when it comes to plastic production into the sea is China, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, all in Asia. And then the world's most vulnerable deltas are in Asia, subject to sinking, flooding, affected by sea level rise. And you know the deltas of Mekong, of Irrawaddy, of the Yellow, of Ganges, Brahmaputra. But of course, and that's a good thing, because in Asia, when you see a threat, you turn it into an opportunity. You know, so and that's what the summit is doing, and I hope the 4th summit will do the same thing. In this day with pandemic and other things, we need to think positive and translate threats into opportunities. And here there are opportunities. For example, PEMC, which is an Asian organization, showed that if you factor in the benefits of linking to the sea, you get a 7-to-1 return. Huge opportunity if you do better in linking. UNEP has programs on marine litter and nutrients in many Asia-Pacific countries. FAO, and I know Amani and maybe Luis is on this call, is doing a lot of work on this in Asia on connecting planning of land, rivers, coasts, and sea, and again trying to link IWRM, integrated river-based management, and integrated coastal management. You know, and things are happening in Myanmar in trying to address the institutional fragmentations with a high-level platform linking forestry and fishery. But the 3rd summit also called for a mechanism to help doing this better. One of them is the Source to Sea platform that I will come back to at the end. Now, we have some projects, and I'm going now Source to Sea platform and the government of Sweden that is supporting it. For example, we had a pilot project on Source to Sea approach in the Vugia to Bon River Basin in Vietnam. You know that's an important river basin. It's 10,000 square kilometers with the cities of the worst living city, Da Nang, and the heritage site, Hoi An. Now the objective and the purpose of this is to try to lay the foundation for better source to sea management by doing 4 things: increasing the knowledge, strengthening the awareness, building local capacity, and highlighting opportunities. I mean, those are the sort of overall objectives. In these basins, see, we looked at the specifics on plastic. I mean, 38 tons per day of plastic are not being collected in this basin. 9 of them is from the urban centers, but they have the highest waste generation, but also the highest collection rate, whereas in the low density areas, the collection rate is a lot lower. So they account for the majority of the 38. And then you have, of course, the coastal and touristic that are direct risk on impacts for plastic. So the Source to Sea approach on plastic management in this basin, as far as we come in the phase where they are now, and I have Ruth Matthews and others from the platform, they are in on this call and they are happy to respond both in the chat and afterwards in the email with you, or if there are specific questions that I cannot answer. But the first 3 steps was to identify the sources, engage the stakeholders, and promote coherent government management. That's where we have to start. So let me then come to the well, I had a stop clock running, but I think I'm doing okay on time. Yumiko will kill me if I go over 25 minutes, I'm sure. So the action platform, let me share with you what that is. Well, that is an action platform for source to sea management that is trying to stimulate partnerships and catalyze action. It's a platform of international, national, regional actors. I'll show you in a little bit who they are. And for example, knowledge generation and sharing is where we have to start. So the platform is trying to get the knowledge and from different sources and generate some together that can help inform us on the issues and the challenges, the opportunities, and the what to do on source to sea approaches. Now, it also tries to support policy and programs, and for that, the platform has a very practical guide for practitioners on how to implement the source to sea approach in projects and programs. And many of our partners are finding this very practical document very useful. We have another one, which is a framework for marine litter prevention with focus on plastic. And that framework has been used, like in Vietnam and in Ethiopia, to underpin how we can help these countries doing better. So this is what the kind of thing that such a platform is doing. The platform has a large number of international and regional organizations, including the key ones like the Global Environment Facility, UNDP unit from that kind of system, the CGIAR system, research organizations, and then also importantly, for example, we have the Danube River Basin, a major transboundary basin in 11 countries, and the Black Sea, where it all ends up. But we don't have the Mekong Basin yet. We don't have the Brahmaputra Basin and the Bay of Bengal. So, but these kind of partners that actually have the problems, and the Orascom and Benguela is the Orange River in Africa that feeds into the Benguela Current. Both of them are partners. So we have those who have the problems as partners. And we really welcome more Asia-Pacific partners. So let me conclude this so I can stay within time. I mean, the short story here is that the SDG agenda that all countries have agreed tells us that we need to think and act holistically and integrated on water from source to sea. That's a clear message, a mandate to all of us. To do that, we need to understand the cycles and the flows. We need to address the fragmentation, and we therefore need to link the implementation of the water and the ocean SDGs. This is what we need to do. And my message here is let's do that together, let's act together. And this platform has been created to help this to happen. So with this, thank you very much for your attention, and over to you, Yumiko and Ravi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Torkil, about a very, very informative presentation about the IWRM, as well as the importance about taking IWF from the perspective of the source to sea. It is very important to address the silo between water stakeholders as well as ocean stakeholders by addressing the holistic view. Thank you. Now I would like to move on to the question and answer, with inviting Mr. Ravi for the facilitator between Torkil and audience. Thank you so much, Ravi, for taking this role.
Thank you, Torkil, for that very, very powerful appeal and talk. I'm going to ask you one question before I turn it to the audience. Is the institutional fragmentation that you talked about in part driven by a failure of us to tell the story as it is? In other words, is SDG 6 capturing the media and the other space, and SDG 14 falling behind? So is there a storytelling issue that drives the myopia that seems to cause these problems? Torkil.
Well, the short answer is yes. I suppose you want a longer answer. Of course. I mean, we all live in our own silos. I mean, we wake up in the morning and do our job, right? If we are freshwater people, we wake up in the morning and we think about that. If we are in a government agency responsible for freshwater management, we look at SDG 6. And we don't spend too much time thinking about the others. So the awareness in the freshwater community that we are the ones who can actually save the oceans, the awareness that 80% of the problems are created by us in the oceans, the awareness is simply not present. And there I showed my own region as a bad example. So let me be fair to my own region as a good example. I live in Denmark. Denmark is a coastal country. In 1987, we found dead lobsters in our coastal waters. And people said, why are these lobsters dead? And then it dawned on people that they were killed by lack of oxygen. And that lack of oxygen was caused by too much nitrate and phosphate in the water. Eutrophication, we call it, right? So it dawned on us suddenly that in order to save our ocean and our coasts, we had to look at what are we doing to it? And then a series of water action plans were generated in Denmark. And all of these water action plans were then monitored against their impact on the adjacent sea. Sweden has an agency which is called the Freshwater and Marine Agency. So it can be done, but in most places of the world, people are living in the silos and they don't, it's not ill will. It's simply, we have limited capacity. So we focus on what we know, our comfort zones.
So is the pressing need to inform the political dispensations who make the policies and carry out programs of the enormity of the challenge and the importance of it? So it's the political message, I suppose, that is part of the issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a political message. And I know we tried from the platform. In 2017, there was a review of the SDG 14, the Ocean SDG. There were thousands of ocean people in New York talking about that. And we then tried to, say, hey, you are the decision makers, the policy makers. What are you thinking about the causes of this? And it was very difficult, almost impossible, to get into the main room of this discussion from the freshwater community. So we had efforts to do that, but it was very difficult. So it is a political problem, but the policymakers need to be informed, and we have to do that.
Okay, and perhaps we'll come to it at the end when we conclude about what is to be done. Yeah. But let me now turn to the questions from the audience. Yumiko, do you want to read out one or two of them?
Yes. Okay, thank you. I have a question about the role of to here. Actually, I have kind of ask people hearing the opinion about role of state or role of interstate river basin organization to address this issue.
The role of the river basin organizations.
Yes, and also the national government.
Yeah. Well, again, my favorite example, I think, is which is an example where Asia is actually also very visible in the rest of the world, is the Mekong. Because the Mekong are doing a lot of things right, and some people will claim a few things not so right. Now, the role of the Mekong River Commission, which is a basin organization, is exactly to get the 6 countries of the Mekong River to have a common understanding on the basis of which they have a common strategy and action. So water doesn't respect national boundaries. So unless we get countries together in a shared basin, we cannot solve the problem. So the basin is the basic unit for water resources management. And as I showed on a previous slide, right? I mean, if you look at the Mekong, right? Then you go to the tributary basins, the Nam Kam River, other rivers, and each of them have also basin organizations. And in fact, in Laos, where I lived for 3 years, it went all the way down to the small ones. So these basins are mechanisms to getting stakeholders together, a very important mechanism. But of course, the decisions and the planning is taken not at the basin level. In many cases, the basin levels are informing, dialoguing, but it's the national governments, the regional governments that are the true decision makers. But the river basins are key to get these decision makers to understand what to do.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Go on, Yumiko. Any others?
Yes. I would like to ask you about the key performance issue of the key performance indicator about the IWRM and how water and ocean stakeholders can solve this issue, and how other stakeholders such as diplomats can also address this issue. Thank you, Torkil.
Yeah, well, I showed in one of the slides this support program with UNEP and the UNEP DHI Center and the Global Water Partnership. These are organizations that are helping on achieving the IWRM target, and they look at the indicator 651, IWRM at all levels. Now, to be honest, and these are my friends, so I take the risk of saying they are not doing well enough on addressing this linkage. And it's not that they don't know, because they do. And a lot of the source to see is anchored in UNEP. But when it comes to achieving that particular targets, there's still too much freshwater bias, freshwater blindness, and too little interaction with coastal stakeholders. I can say this because I know that those people who do that are very well aware and are trying to link, but there's still a way to go. And that's why when we support countries in this, we have to carry this message with us and say, listen, remember the responsibility we have for the ocean below us.
And it could be, Torkil, that the oceans are so large that people think, oh, there's a lot of water to absorb a lot of nonsense, so perhaps it doesn't matter so much. And that needs to be quickly. Yeah,
I mean, the bigger the problem is, the less you can relate to it. That's what you're saying, right? I mean, the big ocean. So, but I mean, then when the ocean hits you, right? when you get a cyclone, and maybe that cyclone is getting worse because of climate change, and maybe climate change is getting worse because of our bad actions, then you're hit, right? Or when climate change induces sea level rise, and suddenly you have to grow shrimps instead of rice because the water is getting salty. Or sometimes you then discover, hey, maybe that also affects me. But I think you're right that our sort of frame of reference is what we can easily relate to. So it's easier to address the deltas, for example. We can walk in the deltas, and maybe the near coast, the mangroves, the corals, you know, it's easier to comprehend than the big ocean. But they are suffering equally. From the coast to the big ocean, there's a major problem. And that problem is accelerated by climate change.
Yes, and I suppose one of the problems is that we don't pay enough attention to SDG 17, which is about cooperation and collaboration. You talked about institutional fragmentation, and perhaps that's one indication that no one's paying attention to SDG 17.
Well, you're right. And I think SDG 17 was a very wise addition to the SDG agenda, because people realize that although the 16 other SDGs tend to be formulated and addressed in silos, unless we have partnerships running across, we can't do the job. So where I see people addressing the SDGs, people are pretty good at actually remembering SDG 17. So I think also the water sector, the water community is a better word, I think, is talking a lot about partnerships and partnerships across sectors So I think that thinking is well developed in the water community, and in the Asia Pacific Water Forum is a big partnership, is it not? So, but I think the fact that there is an SDG specifically on this is really important.
Yumiko, any other questions?
Yes, yes. So it's, we have also question about the way to operate more appropriately and practically about the IWRM. So is there any other opinion or comment from Torkil?
Well, I could talk 2 hours about that, but I will not do that. But what I will say is this. As I said, IWRM is intuitively very simple, right? It's not rocket science. It's getting the policies, the laws right, getting the institutions right, and giving these institutions management. It's very, very simple. But then IWRM has not been well understood. And that's a communication problem we have in the waters. When IWRM has been seen as a water approach belonging to the water people, then people from the food sector that use 70% of all the water, or people from the energy sector, they don't know about it, they don't care about it. So I think IWRM has been, was one of the, from the water perspective, the key outcomes of the Rio summit in 1992. And it has been monitored in Rio +10 and Rio +20, and we're doing better. But we are not, and that's the key issue, we're not reaching out properly. And when we don't do that, then IWRM is negating itself. This is why, for example, in 2011, up to the Rio +20 in 12, this water, food, energy nexus was formulated. To stress the fact that the major water users, the food sector and the energy sector, unless we are hand in hand, we cannot make IWRM happen. Again, in the Mekong, if you don't have a clear understanding about the energy ministries in these 6 countries and the food ministries on what we do to each other, your IWRM plans becomes meaningless. So it is IWRM very easy to say and very hard to do, and there have been a lot of critics. Some critics are academics who have to write papers, and it's good to be critical, then you, but, and some of them have had some key points, but I think it was a milestone in this whole debate that we managed, we the world, to get IWRM recognized as a target of the SDG agenda. When that happened in 2015, people no longer ask if we should do IWRM, they ask how. And when asking the question of how is when we are challenged to reach out and see how does IWRM, as I showed, link to the water, food, energy nexus, to the ecosystem approach to biodiversity, and so forth. So yeah, sadly, it's easy to say, hard to do, but the trick is to now use the opportunity we have of this target and direct it to all countries to make this target happen, to do better.
So Yumiko, perhaps a last couple of questions, and then we can wrap up.
Yes, we will have another last question, is how to minimize the plastic waste and make the aquatic environment safe for sea and ocean. It would be helpful if you can also take the role of each stakeholder to address this issue.
Yeah, I mean, the question is how we can mobilize the stakeholders to do better on plastic, is it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. I think that I showed the case of the basin in Vietnam, and when you try to address this issue, one of the first things you want to do is to exactly enlighten the stakeholders, get them together and see how we can do better. And your plastic is a big issue. You have the big plastic and the floating around, but you have also the microplastic and how you address that. And there are the different communities involved in this are now coming together and doing better. I don't know, Ruth, who was the project manager of this, is on the call and on the chat, so maybe Ruth can add to this. But it was clear to me, from what Ruth told me anyway, that unless the stakeholders understand the problem and commit themselves to working together, we can't solve it. But maybe Ruth can elaborate in the chat.
Do you want to do that, Ruth? If you're there, please unmute your mic.
Ravi and Torkil, is it okay to accept one more question?
I'm in your hands, Yumiko.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you. We have also a question about the way about the effective means of upstream and downstream connectability to address transboundary basins issues.
The upstream, downstream in the transboundary basins?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that is the key issue for all transboundary basins, right? I mean, not just in the Mekong, but also I worked also in the RLC and the Amudarya, in the basins of Central Asia, where in the upper part of the basins, you're building big dams for hydropower. And then in the lower part of the basins, the agricultural producers are complaining, right? And then what happens is that the first thing is that the people's intuitive reaction is, oh, those guys who are building dams upstream are really bad. They are destroying it for us. Rather than asking the question, how can we both benefit from this? How can this become win-win? Because if the upstream countries are building dams to produce electricity, then they also have the opportunity to use these dams to the benefit of the downstream. The downstream countries are suffering every year from droughts, right? But when the energy people build dams in the upstream, they can save some water from the wet to the dry season and help. So the trick is the dialogue. The trick is to understand how can we each achieve what we want to achieve while helping each other. And in most cases, when you analyze it and when you look at where you have successful cases and where you don't, the key is a dialogue between the upstream and the downstream countries. And don't forget one thing, I mean, the transboundary basins are depending entirely on the national governments. That's where the decisions are made in the individual countries. So therefore, unless these countries talk to each other, they can't make the right decisions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Torkil. That was very interesting. For us in the Asia Pacific region, it's extremely important that this issue is flagged at the summit that's coming up in 2022 and included in the political declaration so that there is a charter against which the political leadership is measured. So it's important to get that messaging right. It's also important, I suppose, when these different water conferences are held, to ask the participants to think about the second order problems that are created. If you concentrate just on agriculture, what happens to the second order? What happens to the micronutrients? So you benefit somewhat and you lose somewhat. So how do you turn it into a win-win game? And that depends on dialogue, as Torkil has said. SDG 17, collaborate, dialogue. And above all, it's a moral issue, above all. It's a moral issue. We're all our brothers and sisters keepers, and we're all responsible for each other. And therefore, we need not to be cynical, but to be progressive in our thinking and saying, how can we all benefit? Because science has shown us many ways in which we can do that. So, Torkil, do you have any words to conclude, or do you have anything else to say? Otherwise, I'll call.
I have a lot to, I always have a lot to say. Some people say too much, but I'll save you. No, I mean, I had this last slide which sums it all up, okay? But I mean, what I really think is that this webinar and these events are so important because they're getting people together. And I think it's building up to the 4th summit. And I think if we can try to get our act together up to the 4th summit, then we can mobilize from the platform the actors at the global level and regional actors from other regions to share experience with Asia. And then we can maybe have a more powerful and more documented message to the 4th summit. So my appeal is that we would really encourage people from, and your partners of the Asia Pacific Water Forum, but also those that are not, because you probably don't have many marine partners in the Asia Pacific Water Forum, is to get those guys on board. And if we can work on this together, then we can make a more difference at the 4th summit than if we don't. And so if you could help us doing that, I think together we could really make a big difference in the 4th summit to actually make the message clear, operational, and get people to commit to act on it.
Thank you, Torkil. Thank you very much. And I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Torkil for his very enlightening and very powerful and very central message of the fact that the oceans and saltwater and freshwater do mix, but they mix in a way that is not always very healthy, and we need to make it so. And therefore, what his messages and his examples of how where people put their minds to it, things can succeed is extremely important, so that people don't throw up their hands and saying it's too much. It's too much, but we can do something about it. So thank you very, very much, Torkil. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Torkil, and also thank you for Ravi for excellent summary of this webinar. Thank you, and we will continuously working together with you to address this source-to-sea issue and also for more multi-stakeholder partnership for this issue. Thank you so much. I also thank you for your excellent work to deliver your message from 3rd APWS to the 4th APWS. Thank you.
Thank you, Torkil. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I also thank you to all the audience to join this webinar. Now, I would like to introduce the next APWF webinar. Next APWF webinar will be organized in 22nd December, 3 to 4 p.m. on Japan time. The topic is Asia Pacific Water Development Outlook 2020 and the water financing in Asia and the Pacific. Although 2020 is a flagship document coordinated by ADB, and Dr. Tom Panetta, Chief of Water Sector Group of the Asian Development Bank, will introduce about the issue and discuss with you about the challenge and opportunity about water financing in Asia and the Pacific. Our secretariat will send you about the registration form by Zoom, by email. So please join us for next APWF webinar as well. And lastly, we will also share your presentation document from Dr. Torkil about today's webinar. Then we will also upload this recording of the webinar on our APWF website. I hope you can catch up these topics continuously, then work together with us. Any question is very cordially appreciated. So thank you so much for keeping us through this APWF webinar. I thank you for Dr. Torkil, Ravi, and also all audience. Now I would like to complete this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.